Well, good afternoon, Mr. Humber. It's really nice to be here on purpose. I think that I was a stand-in about 7 years ago for another keynote speaker, and I'm pretty sure I had the pleasure of meeting you at that time, Mr. Humber. And so it's nice to be joining the college again today as your keynote. I'm going to begin by reading a little bit of an excerpt from my book, Subdivided. It is one that I share when I am engaging audiences that are predominantly women and gender diverse individuals or students, because it actually harkens back to my childhood, and it really, in a significant way, geographically locates me and sets good ground for understanding some of the other ideas that I will share with you, and also for understanding my practice focus and principles overall. So I'm reading from a chapter in Subdivided called Designing Dignified Social Housing. As a kid, I lived in a tower at the end of the trainless street. Each summer, the bushes out back wore sweet raspberries as a reprieve from the unyielding sun and oppressive poverty. But when Mikey the Pimp moved into my neighborhood in the early 1980s, that tiny bit of grace was lost. From afar, I watched him seduce Kate, a stocky blonde who was barely a teen, with a skittish gaze and an uncomfortable giggle. Soon, he also won over her welfare-dependent single mother and moved into their fourth-floor apartment. Having established a base for his business, he recruited neighborhood girls, many of whom were the older sisters of my friends. All of them had intersecting vulnerabilities: poverty, low performance in school, prior sexual violations, and or the lack of a male caregiver. Mikey's two cohorts and a couple of clients, clearly from more affluent neighborhoods, followed, not yet 13. I didn't fully comprehend what was happening, but I knew enough to mistrust men who wore red snakeskin shoes and shiny shirts. It wasn't that I was afraid. In my building, I regularly navigated blown-out hallway lights, perpetually broken elevators, shattered beer bottles from last night's fight, and women brawling over washing machines. But with Mikey the Pimp's arrival, I sensed an unfamiliar foreboding. Sadly, my instincts were right. One evening, while I was regaling my mother with the details of my day, a news report on TV caught my attention. The remains of a violated girl. Identifiable only through dental records had been found by a group of Boy Scouts. Not just any girl. The victim was Brittany, the older sister of one of my friends. She'd been working for Mikey the Pimp. Although I'm many miles and years beyond that tragedy, my inner 12-year-old self compels me to search for Brittany. I recently found her online in an article focused on the man who murdered her. She was a mere footnote, an insignificant girl from an insignificant neighborhood. Can we pull my presentation up, please? I begin by sharing this particular story because my presentation is going to center on issues of urban equity, and I just want to be so incredibly clear that these issues are not new to me, and that they are profoundly important to me, and that they predate COVID. The city has become increasingly inequitable over a number of decades, and COVID has presented, I wouldn't say ever, an opportunity, because I think that that is very flip language that doesn't recognize the suffering and the loss of life. But what it's presented is an obligation, a moment to be more accountable than ever before. It is calling us into more courageous and uncomfortable conversations that demand clear action. And so today I'm talking about rethinking environmentalism and land use but I'm really centering this conversation around the social inequities that we've experienced across cities for decades, and particularly over the past half year. Slide, please. The drowning. So, I've been working nonstop during this pandemic, everything from delivering even more keynotes than I normally do and sitting on a lot of panels. I've been organizing community care initiatives specifically for Black and Indigenous single mothers. To be transparent, I was raised by a single mother, and I really recognize the impact that women have had to face during this pandemic, but particularly single women and their children. And so I've been really fundraising, donating myself, and really trying to amplify the community care initiatives that have emerged by activists and others who spend all of their time on the front lines, and we should be so incredibly grateful to those individuals. So I've been just trying to follow their lead and to support them. And I've also experienced considerable personal loss during this pandemic. And one of those losses is the loss of a friend and her unborn baby, who was 8 months. 8 months in terms of the birth process. So a viable child who could have been delivered, and an incredible woman who was a scholar, an educator, an activist. And so I actually attended my first Muslim funeral via Zoom, and it was a surreal experience. The other tragedy that happened is, when Bill was introducing me, he mentioned that I do a lot of work around SWAT sites. That is one of the project focuses in my portfolio. I do a lot of work in the American South. And that work is centered around the reimagining and redesign of Confederate monument spaces. And so actually 2 days after losing my friend, I lost a young man to a drowning in the American South. And his last words were, "I can't swim." And one of the reasons that I was really struck by that is that as an urbanist with a practice that is focused on urban design and also social equity, one of the things that I knew immediately based on my research and my practice experience is that African Americans and also Indigenous peoples, but on both sides of the border, sometimes face up to 5% more, have higher rates of drowning than the general population because of amenity inequity. And so let me explain what that means. We have poorly designed, low-income, racialized communities that oftentimes just get like a little basketball hoop and that's it. They don't have libraries and swimming pools and adequate child care centers. And so when that happens, when we have a lack of amenities in neighborhoods, what that means is that young people are not afforded the opportunity, and I would say the human right, to develop life skills such as learning how to swim. And so what that means is that when they become adults and they have children, the odds of their children learning how to swim significantly decrease as well. And this is linked to a structural inequity that actually goes all the way back to segregation and segregated amenities. And so we had that. I know I'm talking about an incident that happened in the American South, but we also definitely had segregation here in Canada. And so amenity inequity is entrenched in the city's foundation, and it is still killing people today. And it killed a young man, and it didn't need to happen. So I'm starting right here. I want you to think about that, because oftentimes we think about social issues in one silo, And then we think about design, environmental, land use issues in another silo. I want you to think about this particular incident, and I want you to think about the ways that policy, land use decisions, inclusive of segregation and amenity inequity, how that all came together and resulted in a loss of life. Slide, please. So, you know, I started talking about some of the projects that I work on. So again, I work on Confederate monument sites, redesigning, reimagining them. I recently finished some work in Vancouver pertaining to the redesign of the major bridge, looking at that redesign through a gender responsive lens. So working with women who are disabled, women who are transportation planners, and former city councilors, and mothers, and women who caregive for their elders, really sort of walking the area and the bridge itself, sharing stories that, you know, daylight their lived experiences, looking at also the larger history of the design of that bridge, which leads us right back, actually, which led right back to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Let me tell you how that happened. So the iteration of the bridge's redesign displaced a number of street-involved individuals, many of whom were sex workers, not all, but some, and other Indigenous individuals and other racialized and non-racialized populations who were unhoused. It pushed them into the east side, and in so doing, it was, you know, there was a report that calls it a killing ground for Robert Pickton. The provincial government in BC actually had to acknowledge that the redesign of this bridge actually contributed to missing and murdered women. So again, it's so important that we think about how history, colonization, anti-indigeneity, the displacement of Indigenous not only places but people. One of the things that I'm going to say so clearly is that environmental movements often fall down because they actually sometimes privilege wildlife and green space above human lives. I know that's very difficult for some people to hear, but I'm going to say it again. A lot of mainstream environmentalists privilege green space and wildlife above human life. And because of that, the movement hasn't been nearly as successful as it should and could be. And I say this as a proud environmentalist. But what I'm saying today is that we need to have more complex conversations that are justice-based, that are intersectional, that don't push actual human bodies out of the way to protect a space or another living being, that we need to really believe that there is enough justice for all of us. I tell people this often, and I'm talking about there's enough justice for all human beings, and there's a way to live in a harmonious and just manner with the natural environment as well. So, as I was saying, the work that I did in Vancouver was around Granville Bridge and using a gender-based lens to look at that. I was also in Chattanooga doing some work with women there about the reclamation of public spaces, and we kicked our shoes off when we had a spontaneous play date in public. That was a lot of fun. I also engaged young children. We often say that children are the future. This gets said within urbanism and environmentalism a lot, but I would say that we do a poor job engaging actual children, respecting their intelligence, and really bringing them into this conversation. And that goes well beyond Greta. We need to be, engaging all of the children, not a couple of single success stories who become a voice for the movement. Slide, please. So, again, I also make it a point to take my work to the street. That is the locus of where my work happens. I often joke and say that, you know, the city is my studio. I don't work out of an office. I am often on planes, and I'm very aware of the environmental impact of that as well. It is true that I work across almost 20 North American cities, and when I can avoid flying, I do. I will take a train, but I do have to fly quite a bit. And when I'm in cities, I try to do as much as possible while I'm there to reduce how much I fly and my own carbon footprint. And a lot of my work happens on street corners and in the middle of the night. I sometimes work from 11 a.m. until 3 a.m. in the morning. You know, when I was doing some engagement for the Honest Beds Project, for example, I stood at the corner of Bathurst and Bloor, and I spoke to young families going out to brunch. I spoke to people coming down to the city to do their daily shopping. I was there when families were tired and getting their children home for naps and getting them cleaned up for the evening. And then youth were coming out to go to clubs and parties. And I was still there at 2 a.m. in the morning when the all-night bus came and all of the workers piled off the all-night bus workers that we don't tend to see, but who keep our cities running, the same essential workers that we finally are paying a little bit of attention to during this pandemic. And I got to talk to them about the redevelopment of the site and to get their perspectives as well. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I learned that gleaners come out. I don't know if you know what I mean by gleaners. It was an education for myself. These are individuals who go through trash and sometimes curbside looking for plastic glass and metal to be able to cash it in, to be able to eat. And I will never forget a gleaner who was an elderly woman whom I met that night, who told me that, you know, her benefits run out. And so at the end of every month, she comes out at 3 a.m. in the morning, and people in the neighborhood actually know her, so they leave extra stuff out for her, and she collects that, she gets money for it, and that's how she eats for the rest of the month. Imagine your grandmother out at 3 a.m. in the morning looking for plastic and metal so that she can have meals for the end of the month when her disability or old age allowance or pension runs out. We have a problem, Toronto, and we need to do better. Slide, please. So we can no longer dismiss the facts and theory as rhetoric. It's time for a reckoning. And, you know, I've been talking about these situations. I am extremely well versed. I always bring evidence. There's lots of facts that I could wow off to you. So, for instance, we know that across North American cities, sometimes women cycle 40% less than men because of gender-based violence on our streets. And so a lot of mainstream urbanists advocating for safe and complete streets refuse to talk about any issues intersecting with identity, such as race and gender, no more. We need to talk about identity. In fact, yesterday I read an article about a woman who was cycling, and the passenger of a vehicle leaned out and smacked her. She died, and he also fell out of the vehicle and died. So he murdered this woman and then also lost his own life. And, you know, research shows that women actually don't cycle at particular times of the day or are not using active transportation options, which we know is the best for the planet. We need to walk more and cycle more and take public transit more. But we can't get to our environmental goals if women are getting slapped while they're on their, their bikes and getting murdered. We can't do that if women have self-imposed curfews. So they can't, cycle home at 2 in the morning because they're afraid of the threat of violence or sexual harassment. We will not meet our environmental goals if racialized people, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous men are profiled on public transit and on our streets. We will not get to our environmental goals if Black men continue to be executed on streets that are supposed to be streets that are enabling us to lower our carbon footprint and, really nurturing our mental health and creating social connectivity. So please know that without equity, there is no reaching these lofty environmental goals. So if you don't want to deal with these messy, uncomfortable, long-standing issues, know that if you're not qualified to have those conversations, to have a little bit of humility and reflexivity, you can throw all of your environmental goals out the window. We need to have more holistic, and as I say, courageous conversations. This is not about rhetoric, it's about evidence, it's about reckoning. Slide, please. So, reckoning means confronting planning's historical and current role in perpetuating urban inequity. One of the things that is very difficult for my colleagues to hear me say is that planning is tethered to colonization. Colonization is essentially the act of stealing land, carving up land, deciding on uses of land. Does any of that sound familiar? And then deciding who goes where and what they're able to do when they go where. So planning is an offshoot of that. And so when we're thinking about whether we're thinking about planning parks, green spaces, transforming hydro corridors or housing, planning amenities, this is not separate from colonization, so we cannot have this conversation without talking about whose land are we trying to protect, how we have commodified that land, and how we've harmed the first peoples of those lands. So again, this whole environmental conversation that doesn't look at a history of displacement of indigenous peoples and a lot of other people as well. So if we look at the mid to late 1960s, when we had a lot of urban renewal schemes and built a lot of car-centric infrastructure, again, my colleagues will talk about how that, created a terrible precedent for single-family homes, as well as car-centric neighborhoods. We know that these things are not good for the environment, but what they don't talk about is the fact that car-centric infrastructure was weaponized against low-income communities and Black communities. So in Canada, we know that there's a story of Africville where car-centric infrastructure displaced an entire community where people owned their homes. They had schools and churches and gathering places, totally wiped out that community and pushed those people into public housing, and creating a different kind of dependency on the state and erasing a proud legacy of community building and also, intergenerational wealth, which is very important to Black populations who have been enslaved for 500 years. So just imagine a Black community getting a financial foothold, becoming completely wiped out and forced into public housing while we destroyed the land. And I want to also be clear that we have some poor white communities in this country, and they're often erased and ignored in some of our most affluent, beautiful green spaces like Muskoka. We have some trailer parks, and a lot of people would want to dismiss these populations using a term that really irks me, which is white trash. Really discarding these individuals because they don't happen to be poor, because they don't happen to be middle class or respectable, whatever that means. We need to have these conversations about how race and class and gender operate within the ways in which we're envisioning space and also envisioning land and our relationship with land. Not only is our relationship with land broken, our relationship with one another is and has always been profoundly broken. The moment we asserted this idea of race, which is truly not rooted in any type of biology. So Bill, a white man, and I, a Black woman, could actually have more closer DNA than me and someone else who is Black. So I just want to be so clear here that race is a social construct used to actually steal land and oppress people. And so again, there's so many synergies and such interconnectivity around social injustice and environmentalism. Slide, please. So it is really critical that we change our relationship with land. And this might sound counterintuitive. We need to stop talking about land use, because land use has actually amounted to land abuse. Let me say this for you one more time. Land use has actually amounted to land abuse. We were never meant to commodify and financialize land. That is not what land is for. We were meant to be stewards of the land. Our Indigenous peoples of Canada, along with our Indigenous peoples all around the world, have for thousands of years stewarded land. The land wasn't owned per se, and it wasn't financialized. That actually happened when colonization happened. So just one more time, we can't talk about, returning to a harmonious relationship with land without really confronting the ugly issue of colonization, because colonization took us away from a harmonious relationship with land as good stewards of the land, respecting the land and all living beings, to positioning ourselves as masters, as owners of the land. We need to try to undo this as much as possible. So for me, I am not quite sure how we're going to get back to a purer, sort of stewardship relationship. But I think that it is a big question for us to think about. How do we become land stewards and not land owners? And this whole idea of land use as well really promotes urban inequity and social inequities, because it talks about the highest and the best use. So highest and best use is always defined by the value of the land, but the value that you can extract from the land based on its uses. That is in no way aligned with stewardship and reclaiming and our relationship with land and having a harmonious relationship with land. And so we need to really, again, move away from this idea of land use, because it is land abuse. And when we're thinking about highest and best use, no, we need to look at the highest and best outcomes for people and the land itself. Because if we don't have the highest and best outcomes for the land, then we will not have the highest and best use for human beings. It's impossible. The relationship is so intermeshed that we always have to be thinking about the land, not just as, an inanimate sort of object that we just extract from. We need to be in better and right relationship with land. We also need to rethink our right to the city. So, during, COVID, as we've seen, it's been so alarming, but perhaps not surprising. There have been groups who've marched against wearing masks, groups who feel like they have a right to be everywhere and to not follow, directives given by really intelligent people who are trained to guide us through a global pandemic. And that is because people have too much unhealthy spatial entitlement. That is a term that I've coined in my practice. We need to move away from this idea to having a right to the city and to understand that rights come with what? Responsibility. No one wants to deal with this idea of responsibility. So everyone should have the space they need. I think everyone should have healthy spatial entitlement, but people don't have a right without responsibility. And what those responsibilities are is making sure that we wear a mask, even if we feel like we would be healthy and be okay. We need to value our elders. It is alarming to me that people are willing, not only everyday citizens, but also some global leaders, are willing to dismiss how serious this pandemic is, because the only people dying are really old people and a lot of racialized people. We know that young people now are starting to die, and it's starting to be fatal as well. And so what we thought in the beginning about who was most vulnerable, that has definitely been proven wrong. But it says something about who we are, that we think that our elders are disposable in this way, and that our essential workers are disposable, and that our low-income people and racialized people are disposable. We also need to look at Jane Jacobs. We need to look at her ideas. Listen, I, as an urbanist, I think that a lot of Jane Jacobs' ideas were innovative and forward-thinking for her time. It is also true that Jane Jacobs wrote books and articulated ideas, when people were talking about sort of like Reconstruction, also the end of World War II, also disability rights, women's rights, and amid a civil rights uprising. And she really doesn't in any meaningful way situate her ideas within that larger social context. And what that's led to is some dramatic errors and gaps. I'm going to tell you about a couple of them. So Jane Jacobs talks about the natural proprietors of the street. So she talks about that. And she also talks about eyes on the street. I'll tell you why these two ideas are fundamentally problematic. When you talk about natural proprietors of the street, that must mean that some people are unnatural proprietors of the street. So who gets to decide who is natural and in place and who is unnatural? And when we talk about keeping our eyes on the street and also surveilling the street, and she also uses language like citizens enforcing our streets, that really brings up and creates the context for terrible social inequities. I'm going to break one down for you really quickly. So what we know is that kind of talk led to crime prevention through environmental design, proven to disproportionately target low-income neighborhoods and unhoused populations. The other thing it led to was neighborhood watch groups. Now, I don't have a huge issue with neighborhood watch groups, citizens coming together and talking about their sense of safety in their neighborhood, not a problem. But this idea of aggressive neighborhood watch groups is a problem, and I'll tell you how that problem unfolded. Trayvon Martin, a young 17-year-old visiting his father, living in a gated community, goes to the convenience store. He buys a pack of Skittles. He's wearing a hoodie. He puts his hood up. He has the Skittles in his pocket. He's on his way back to his home. The neighborhood watch coordinator, George Zimmerman, sees him, so has his eyes on him, determines that he is an unnatural proprietor of that street, because how on earth could this young 17-year-old black man be a resident in a gated community? He calls 911 and says, I see someone who looks suspicious. He looks like he's up to no good. So we can see the racial bias operating right away. The operator tells Zimmerman to stay in his vehicle. Zimmerman somehow finds himself on the street confronting Trayvon, and within moments, this young 17-year-old boy who only had Skittles in his pocket is bleeding out on the sidewalk, dead. Now, I'm not suggesting that Jane Jacobs is responsible for Trayvon Martin's death, nor am I suggesting that her ideas are sort of responsible for the deaths of so many other black men who've been executed on the streets in exactly that manner. But I am clearly saying that research shows that those ideas led to crime prevention through environmental design, as well as neighborhood watch groups. And those ideas were not articulated in a responsible way. They didn't take into account that streets are contested sites, that people have different levels of power on streets, that people have biases, and that some people are violent, and they project their biases and their violence onto other human bodies. And so we do really need to look at, Jane Jacobs through a much more critical lens that is intersectional, to move forward. And I know that will be tough for people, but one of the things that I always say is if we want to keep moving forward, if we believe in this work that we are doing, if we love our cities, if we are in love with resilient cities and in love with environmentalism, we'll be more in love with learning the truth and doing the right things than any of our heroes, for our sense of feeling like we're good people or our sense of being right. So when I come to this work, I have no heroes, including myself, and I'm not committed to my own ideas. Every day, I am open to being proven wrong. I am open to learning new things, and I am committed to being better. And if that means acknowledging that some of my ideas weren't as advanced or as progressive or inclusive as they could be, I'm going to embrace new ideas and learning every single step. And I think that's what makes me a leader in this sector. And I think that's what makes me a pretty reasonably decent human being, period, right? And so I think that's what we want to always bring to this work. We want to bring our humanity, and we also want to bring the best level of professional capacity and true excellence to everything that we're doing. Next, I want us to acknowledge public consultation performance and limitations. So we all know that, public consultation is a farce. It's theater. It's gotten to a place where it's so incredibly dysfunctional. It happens far too late in the process. Major decisions have already been made. You bring people together in a room with 500 people and a microphone. My God, what could go wrong? Of course, everything goes wrong in that kind of setting. People just yell at each other. We need to engage communities earlier in public consultation processes. We need to sit around tables where we actually look at each other and talk to each other respectfully. We need to let the community know what their scope of influence is so that we're not building up people's hopes and that they're, not blue-skying these great big ideas, knowing that 80% of the decisions have already been made. And speaking of 80% of the decisions already being made, we need to move to a co-creation process where the community is at the front end of the process and we're walking with the community. We are not designers bringing the community a solution to their problems. And I'll tell you why that particular framing is wrong. There is not a single community, regardless of how many challenges they are having, that want the places where they live, love, and work to be positioned as a problem. People don't want the places where they live, love, and work to be framed as a problem. And as professionals doing this work, we do not want to propose that we are the solution bringers to these people's problems. We are co-creating good places with communities. We are learning from them. We are also offering our dearth of knowledge and our expertise, of course, but we are walking side by side with community. And that is the spirit that this work has to get done with. And communities are educating themselves more than ever. They will not allow urbanists or environmentalists or developers to impose place on them. They refuse, and I'm glad they are refusing. I am glad we are in a moment where we are renegotiating the social contract in terms of how we create community together. The other thing that is connected to this is centering community knowledge and place-based expertise. So in my own practice, the community is always a part of my team right from day one. The moment a municipality, a developer, or a firm hires me, I then look into the community to hire them. And it's members of the community require training of some kind, I make sure that that training happens as well, and that capacity building happens. But communities should be at the table from day one. And I'll leave you with this last thing. Whenever we start talking about moving toward whether it's engaging communities more or within the field of urbanism more broadly, engaging professionals that come from equity-seeking groups, meaning Indigenous people, racialized people, women, disabled people, we immediately start talking about empowering people. So I'm going to leave you on this note. I want you to think about this. Growing up, I was a girl, I was a poor kid, I was a Black kid, and in second grade, I met my teacher who became my second dad. And he would come to the 4-block radius where I lived, the inner city community where I lived, and he would take me into the broader city. We would take the subway down into the city. I noticed things very young. I noticed that some people had parks and green space. People, were permitted to safely play outside, things that were not possible all the time in my own neighborhood. And that man who became my second dad never, ever said that he was empowering me. In this work, we talk way too much about empowering people. If I could leave you with one idea, it would be this: do not empower people. People are profoundly powerful. Our job is to share space, is to share our information that we've had the privilege of being able to accrue through education and professional experiences. So we're going to share information, and we're also going to share resources, including our financial resources, and also things like mentorship and knowledge, sharing all of our resources. That's the job. The job is not empowering people. I was powerful then, and I'm powerful now. And not because that man who was white, Irish Canadian to be precise, and also gay, not because he showed up and empowered me, but because he showed up as a really humane, decent person in the world. He saw me as having capacity and power and potential, and he walked alongside of me. And because he walked alongside of me, I walk alongside of communities, and I get to do so right across North America. So I thank him always. I thank myself for showing up, for activating my own personal power, and I thank all of you for hearing these ideas this afternoon.
Wow, thank you, Jay. Let me begin by saying I do recall us meeting several years ago when you did speak at Seneca, and thank you for this again. I think your ideas continue to grow and continue to evolve, and that's really what learning is all about, is it not? What more can we say? There I am. I can see myself. We're going to entertain questions from our students, and I'm hoping that they will come through loud and clear. Most of them are asking, I can't hear anything. When will the person start speaking? But I think that these will lead to questions. Talk to us a little bit more about this idea that you mentioned, the concern that some people have in terms of privileging wild space and green space over the needs of communities and people, because some people may not quite get the point that you're making there.
Okay, great question, Bill. So, in a lot of, environmental sort of conversations and initiatives, the mistake that a lot of environmentalists make is, and I don't know if it's, intentional or unintentional, but it doesn't matter, it happens, where environmentalists will come into like a particular space or a country, particularly developing countries, and they will assess that the people who live there are not engaging with the wildlife or the built environment in ways that are progressive or ways that they should. And rather than taking time to understand the cultural context, to understand the structural economic issues, right, that are sort of maybe propelling those kinds of behaviors, they make pronouncements about the behaviors being bad for the environment and thereby the populations being bad and backwards for the environment. And so they protect the environment while vilifying the people who've been stewards of that environment for thousands of years before they parachuted in with their colonial, right white ideas on a Wednesday. And it's so important to just walk gently and to listen more and to not make big pronouncements and to also have the analysis to understand like how culture works and how economic forces work and how cities are coming about and how all of those things coalesce to contribute to the ways in which people are engaging with environmental matters. I want to say one other thing to your question, because this is a big one for me, and I think about it quite a bit. You know, those of us in the West, we have spent about 50 years destroying the environment. That's true. We consume, like we make up this much of the world's population and consume this much, okay? And we've been doing that for 50 years, and we've been calling it progress. We have sold the single-family home, and we sold the vehicle that has dramatically, also impeded environmental sort of well-being, right? So we've done this for 50 years, and then we woke up one day and we said, this isn't going to work anymore. This is totally bad and backwards. And not recognizing that the rest of the world was looking at us. They were looking at us sell this dream. They were looking at the ways we've been extracted and the ways that we've consumed that are so deeply harmful to the environment. We sold them that dream, and now we're pointing our finger at those very people saying they're doing all of the wrong things when we've built considerable wealth on their backs and on the backs of the environment. So we need to kind of have a bit of a reckoning here. It's obnoxious to now go and tell these people and go into so-called developing countries and tell them that we've gotten it all wrong before even atoning or acknowledging for the ways that we have in the West primarily destroyed the environment. And when I say we, I don't like to be as reductive as always just talking about race without talking about class or talking about particular parts of our environment, our identities rather. That is why I'm saying we, but to be clear, most of the we aren't people who look like me, and they're not mostly women either. It's a very sort of capitalistic, patriarchal sort of approach at land extraction and generating wealth, but none of us have clean hands because we've all benefited from it and we've all contributed to hurting the environment. So that's what I mean.
Right, Jay. I'm going to take over just briefly because I saw as you were actually talking about Trayvon Martin, there was somebody in the chat or the Q&A said, did this happen in the United States? And a lot of times that rhetoric in Canada very specifically comes up. It's the States. Like the state, a different problem there. And of course, it's a different environment. But can you speak a little bit more to specifically why this is our problem as well?
Absolutely. In a call to courage, I talk, I issued a letter called A Call to Courage not so long ago during the pandemic, calling Canadians to courage, calling Canadians to not keep casting their gaze to the U.S. because we have done many of the same things. So again, the ways in which we have come to have car-centric infrastructure has, just as it has hurt racialized communities in the U.S., it's hurt communities here in Canada. I named one, Africville. Hogan's Alley in BC is another community. I gave the example of the bridge redesign and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Windsor. We're very proud of Windsor because that is a great pathway for the Underground Railroad. Most Canadians would be surprised to know two things. I'm going to tell you two things about that. Windsor has a theater that used to have a seating section called the Crow's Nest in reference to the deep American South and Jim Crow. Jim Crow, with all the lynchings and the killing of Black men on the streets and the racial segregation. I just want my fellow Canadians to know that in Windsor, the site that we are so proud of because it was the Underground Railroad, has a theater, and in the theater, we were celebrating and referencing a section that was Black people only, calling it the Crow's Nest. Let me give you another example that is Windsor-based, and I'm not picking on Windsor today, but another example that is Windsor-based is that, Eleanor Roosevelt, I think it was, the First Lady, she came with an activist from the U.S., and they were trying to stay at the same hotel in Windsor, and the hotel told the First Lady that she could stay, but that her guest, who was a Black woman, could not stay. And so these two women actually crossed the border into Detroit to sleep in a hotel where they could sleep together. Not sleep together, I don't want to start a new rumor here, where they could both have a room in the hotel. But let me just point out why that's interesting, right? You would not think that it would be the Canadians practicing the discrimination and the Americans had to go into the U.S. to find accommodation and lodging, right? So I could go on all day and tell Canadians why your pride is false, why your history is incomplete, and why we need to get more information. And when I say when your pride is false, don't get me wrong, and no one tweet at me right now. I came here when I was 4 years old. My life could never be the life that I'm living right now had my mother not immigrated to Canada. So skip all of the ungrateful Canadian tweets. I love this country. I do. And from like poverty and being a woman and racialization, I don't know that my story would be the same anywhere else. But here's my thing. It's not enough. I am not enough. We have a systemic structural problem. So I'm not talking about my personal lived experience. I'm talking about a shared history. And until I am normal and not a success story, I will not rest. We can do better.
Here's one from one of our students, and it's a big question, so we'll try to kind of narrow it down. And it has to do with urban design. Do you have any favorite, I'm going to reword the question somewhat. Do you have any favorite urban design examples that we should be perhaps either doing more of or use as models for doing different, looking at design in a different kind of way?
Interesting. I work across so many cities. I try to avoid giving distinct examples to the kind of favorite cities. But let's just talk about Toronto, maybe, because we're in Toronto. Can we do that? I like what they've done beneath the Beltway, which is a very simple intervention, but it's an all year round sort of public space where they're skating in the winter and gathering in the summer. They also, offer programs where like residents can get involved and program the space, itself. I like that. I like Regent Park. It's not perfect, and so everybody, uses Regent Park and they say it's perfect. It's not perfect. It's an experiment because never in history have we actually tried to live alongside each other across race and across class. That's a grand experiment that we're amid right now because of, the demographic shift in cities and the fact that we realize, surprise, warehousing a bunch of very poor people who don't have access to opportunities is probably not the best idea, right? So I do like that Regent Park is sort of like moving us into a direction, but I dislike the fact that there was displacement, and I dislike the fact that we have decided that it's perfect. Because the truth is, it takes a lot of years to get it right, and it takes a lot of years after the ribbon cutting to create great community. I live in Kensington Market. I'm going to be biased. My community is one of the best examples of urbanism in the city. We have a lot of local businesses. We have markets, local businesses. In fact, Loblaws created a city market, branding itself and competing with our local little grocers who've been here for many years. They're closing down now, and I couldn't be more delighted because I think that it is so important for us to support small local businesses. And, you know, the character of a small community, Kensington is super diverse. Businesses have been here for 40 years. It also, we engage across class and race. Also, we have pedestrian Sundays. I would like this community to be pedestrianized all year round. There's no reason why not. That, you know, I like it for that reason. And also, we're adjacent to Alex Park, and they're undergoing redevelopment. And I'm going to point to Alex Park as well because there was zero displacement, and that makes my heart happy.
I hope I can share with you some of the work that's been done in Atlanta and some research I've done on soccer, where they established these little, they thought they were going to be performing theaters around their MARTA system in Atlanta's inner city, in some of the poorest Black neighborhoods in the United States. And they found out that, that middle-class people weren't going to come down for the concerts. So the Soccer in the Streets program took over these little spaces around their MARTA system and turned them into little soccer pitches, and then turned them into places that the local community kids could work and play, and the teenagers could make money refereeing the games. The kids could play for free. The parents set up a situation where they could come and watch their kids play. It was a kind of a brilliant little idea that through Andrew I'll send on to you, because it's one little example of how you make use of what you have in your own place in ways that are kind of unique to the opportunities that are available there. So I'm going to turn things back to Andrew, our tremendous behind-the-scenes organizer here. He has a number of things that he wants to say to you, Jay, and a number of messages he wants to share with our students. But once again, let me just say thank you very much. This was truly brilliant and eye-opening and makes us think. And that's really what these exercises are all about. Thank you for making us think. Andrew?
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for all of your service. I, heard your contribution to the faculty. Thank you, sir.